The morning mist hung low over Hollywood Burbank Airport as the yellow cab pulled up to the departure terminal. Inside, a man in his 70s checked his watch. 6:20 am, right on schedule. Clint Eastwood stepped out onto the concrete, his weathered hands gripping a single canvas bag that had seen better decades. The bag contained everything he needed for this journey: a change of clothes, basic toiletries, and something infinitely more precious: a triangular folded American flag nestled carefully in tissue paper. He moved with the same deliberate stride that had once commanded respect on movie sets across Hollywood. But today there were no cameras rolling, no directors calling action. Today, he was simply a man keeping a promise to a ghost. The automatic doors of the terminal slid open with a soft mechanical whisper, releasing a wave of recycled air that carried the familiar airport cocktail of coffee, cleaning products, and human anticipation. Clint's black jeans were faded at the knees, his boots scuffed from years of ranch work, and his navy coat hung loose over a simple button-down shirt. No designer labels, no flashy accessories, just the understated uniform of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. His hair, thinner now but still defiant against the morning breeze, caught the fluorescent lights as he surveyed the bustling terminal. Around him, the airport hummed with its usual symphony of organized chaos. Travelers rushed past dragging wheeled suitcases that kicked rhythmically against the polished floor. Flight announcements echoed from overhead speakers in that distinctly robotic tone that somehow managed to sound both urgent and boring simultaneously. Gate agents shuffled papers behind counters, while early morning commuters clutched their coffee cups like lifelines. But none of them noticed the legend walking among them. To the harried business executive checking his phone, Clint was just another senior citizen moving a bit too slowly through the terminal. To the young mother wrestling with a crying toddler and an overstuffed diaper bag, he was simply part of the background noise of travel. To the college students returning from spring break, he was invisible, a relic from a generation they barely acknowledged. Clint understood this invisibility, and in many ways he preferred it. Fame had been a double-edged sword throughout his career, opening doors while simultaneously trapping him behind the glass walls of celebrity. These days, anonymity felt like a luxury he'd earned through decades of giving pieces of himself to strangers who thought they knew him from his movies. This morning, however, the anonymity served a deeper purpose. He wasn't traveling as Clint Eastwood, Hollywood icon. He was traveling as Clint, the young soldier who had once shared foxholes and fears with a man named Ray Kowalski. Ray, who had dragged him to safety during a firefight in 1967, when shrapnel had torn through Clint's shoulder. Ray, who had written letters to Clint's mother when communication from the front lines was sporadic. Ray, who had remembered every birthday, every movie premiere, every milestone with the loyalty of a brother. The memorial service in Boise would be small. Ray's family, a handful of old army buddies, and the stories they carried of a man who had lived quietly but loved deeply. Ray's daughter had called personally, her voice breaking slightly as she asked if Clint might say a few words. Nothing fancy, she had whispered through the phone. Just something to honor the man who always spoke so proudly of his friend Clint. He had said yes without hesitation, the same way Ray had once answered every call for help. Now, as Clint approached the ticket counter, his fingers unconsciously traced the outline of the folded flag in his coat pocket. He had carried it through 3 wars in his movies, but this morning it would serve its truest purpose, honoring a real hero whose name would never appear on any marquee. The Phoenix Western counter sat at the far end of the terminal, marked by blue and silver signage that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Behind the counter, Josh Martinez was having the kind of morning that made him question his life choices. At 23, he had imagined his college degree would lead somewhere more prestigious than checking boarding passes at 6:30 am. But student loans had a way of humbling even the most ambitious dreams. Josh's uniform shirt was crisp, his name tag polished, and his coffee was strong. the perfect armor for dealing with the endless parade of travelers who seemed to believe that airline employees existed solely to complicate their lives. He had perfected a particular expression over his 8 months on the job. Polite enough to avoid complaints, but detached enough to maintain his sanity. It was a look that said, "I'll help you, but don't expect me to care." When Clint approached the counter, Josh was deep in that morning rhythm of robotic efficiency. Scan the boarding pass, check the ID, print the luggage tags, offer the practiced smile, and move to the next customer. The assembly line of human interaction that kept airports running and customer service representatives emotionally numb. "Good morning," Clint said, placing his boarding pass and California driver's license on the counter with the gentle precision of a man who had learned patience through decades of practice. Josh glanced up briefly, just long enough to register an older man in casual clothes. Nothing about Clint's appearance suggested importance or urgency. No expensive watch, no platinum credit cards, no first-class boarding pass. Just another senior citizen probably flying to visit grandchildren or attend some family gathering that Josh would forget before his shift ended. "Flight 1423 to Boise," Josh mumbled, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced indifference. But something made him pause. The computer screen flickered, showing an error message that made his eyebrows furrow. He tried again, hitting the keys with slightly more force, as if the machine was personally insulting his competence. Josh muttered, more to himself than to Clint. "You're not showing up in the system." It was a lie, but Josh had learned that small lies made his job easier. The truth was that Clint's seat had been changed, bumped to accommodate a last-minute passenger who had paid extra for priority boarding. It happened dozens of times each day, and Josh had developed a routine for handling these situations. Blame the computer, act slightly inconvenienced, and let the passenger deal with the consequences. "Mind telling me why?" Clint asked, his voice carrying the calm curiosity of someone genuinely seeking information rather than looking for a fight. The question caught Josh off guard. Most passengers either accepted his explanations without question or immediately launched into complaints about airline service. But this man's tone suggested something different, an expectation that questions deserved answers. That basic courtesy was a two-way street. Josh felt a familiar irritation rising in his chest. He was tired of explaining airline policies to people who didn't understand how the industry worked. He was tired of being polite to strangers who would forget his name before they reached their gate. Most of all, he was tired of pretending that every passenger's minor inconvenience was his personal responsibility. "Sir, the system shows what it shows," Josh replied, his tone shifting from neutral to defensive. "I'll need to flag this for a random review." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Josh's fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to escalate a simple seat change into something much more complicated. He had the power to make this stranger's morning difficult, and something about Clint's quiet confidence made Josh want to exercise that power. It was a decision that would haunt him for months to come. The transformation happened so gradually that nearby passengers didn't notice at first. What began as a routine ticket counter interaction was slowly morphing into something else entirely, a power struggle disguised as customer service. Josh's fingers danced across his keyboard with newfound purpose, each keystroke carrying the weight of a man who had decided that cooperation was optional. "Random review," Josh announced, loud enough for other travelers to hear. The words were carefully chosen, designed to suggest that Clint had somehow triggered security protocols rather than simply asked a reasonable question. It was airline theater at its finest, the performance of authority where none actually existed. Clint stood perfectly still, his canvas bag resting at his feet, his hands relaxed at his sides. He had encountered this type of behavior before, in Hollywood boardrooms and military briefings, where insecure people wielded small amounts of power like medieval weapons. The key, he had learned, was to never give them the reaction they were fishing for. "I understand you need to check your system," Clint said calmly. but I'd still like to know why my seat was changed. The simplicity of the request seemed to irritate Josh even more. Here was a passenger who refused to be intimidated, who continued asking logical questions even when faced with bureaucratic stonewalling. Josh's jaw tightened as he reached for his phone, dialing a number he had memorized for situations exactly like this. "Yeah, I need a supervisor at counter 12. Josh spoke into the receiver, his eyes never leaving Clint's face. Passenger is being difficult. The word difficult hung in the air like an accusation. Several travelers in line behind Clint exchanged glances, their conversations dropping to whispers. A young mother pulled her children closer, while a businessman checked his watch nervously. The atmosphere had shifted from routine inconvenience to something that felt dangerous, though no one could quite explain why. Within minutes, 2 TSA officers appeared, their presence as sudden and imposing as storm clouds. They moved with that particular walk that law enforcement officers perfect, not hurried, but purposeful in a way that suggested they already knew who the problem was before they arrived. Their name tags read Officer Martinez and Officer Chen, and their expressions carried the practiced neutrality of people who had seen every possible airport drama. "Sir, we're going to need you to step aside," Officer Martinez said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Clint turned to face the officers, his movements slow and deliberate. "May I ask what for?" It was the same question he had asked Josh, polite, reasonable, and apparently inflammatory. Officer Chen stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his radio, a gesture that spoke louder than any verbal threat. "Random security screening, sir. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." There it was again, that word difficult. It seemed to be the theme of the morning, applying to anyone who dared to ask why in an environment where, "because I said so" was considered sufficient explanation. Clint reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his veteran's identification card, the plastic worn smooth from years of carrying it in his wallet. "I'm happy to comply," Clint said, extending the card toward Officer Martinez. "But I'd like to understand what triggered this screening." Officer Martinez barely glanced at the veteran's ID before handing it back. "Sir, identification doesn't override security protocols. We need you to come with us now." The dismissal was swift and absolute. 40 years of military service, reduced to irrelevant paperwork. A simple question about a seat change escalated into a federal security matter. And somewhere in the background, Josh watched with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully transformed his own incompetence into someone else's problem. The die was cast, and everyone involved was about to learn that some mistakes echo far beyond the moment they're made. The side corridor felt like stepping into a different dimension, one where the normal rules of human interaction had been suspended in favor of cold efficiency. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that seemed designed to make people uncomfortable, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow that drained the warmth from even the kindest faces. Officer Martinez led the way down the narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing off the institutional tile floors. Officer Chen followed behind Clint, close enough to suggest supervision without quite crossing into intimidation. The walls were painted that peculiar shade of beige that existed only in government buildings, a color that somehow managed to be both sterile and depressing simultaneously. "Right here, sir," Officer Martinez said, gesturing toward a small room marked only with a number, 7. The space inside was barely larger than a walk-in closet, furnished with a metal table, 2 plastic chairs, and the kind of overhead lighting that made everyone look guilty of something. A third TSA agent was waiting inside, Supervisor Williams, according to his name tag, a man in his 40s whose expression suggested he had processed so many incidents that individual faces had long since blurred into a forgettable parade of inconvenience. He looked up from his clipboard with the weary resignation of someone who viewed each new situation as another box to check rather than another human being to help. "Mr. Williams began, then paused, realizing he didn't actually know Clint's name. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. They were about to search a man whose identity they hadn't bothered to verify. "Eastwood," Clint replied simply, placing his canvas bag on the metal table with the same careful precision he had used at the ticket counter. Williams nodded absently, already moving into the routine that had become second nature. "We'll need to conduct a complete search of your person and belongings. Standard procedure for flagged passengers." The word flagged hung in the air like an accusation. Clint had gone from a man asking about his seat assignment to a security risk in the span of 20 minutes. And nobody in the room seemed to find his progression unusual or worth explaining. Officer Chen began unpacking Clint's bag with methodical thoroughness, treating each item like potential evidence in a crime that nobody could quite articulate. The clean shirts were unfolded and shaken out. The toiletry bag was opened and each container examined. The worn paperback book, a Louise L'Amour Western that Clint had read dozens of times, was flipped through page by page as if it might contain hidden messages. Then Chen's hands found the folded flag. For a moment, the room fell silent as the officer lifted the triangle of red, white, and blue fabric from its tissue paper wrapping. The flag had been folded with military precision, each crease sharp enough to cut, each star and stripe positioned with the reverence reserved for sacred things. "What's this for?" Chen asked, holding the flag like it was evidence rather than a symbol. "A funeral," Kent replied quietly. "A friend who served." Chen nodded curtly and set the flag aside, but something in his handling of it, casual, indifferent, made Clint's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just about missed flights anymore. This was about the casual disrespect shown to everything that should have mattered. Meanwhile, the clock on the wall ticked past 7:00 a.m. Clint's flight was now boarding, passengers settling into their seats, flight attendants conducting safety demonstrations. Somewhere in that airplane, an empty seat waited, seat 12A, the one that should have carried a man to his friend's memorial service. At 7:10 a.m., the engines would start. At 7:15, the plane would taxi to the runway. And Clint would still be here, watching strangers treat his dignity like optional paperwork. At 7:36 a.m., the institutional silence of the search room was shattered by a sound that shouldn't have been remarkable, the soft hiss of the terminal's main doors sliding open. But something about this particular entrance made Officer Chen look up from his paperwork, made Supervisor Williams pause mid-sentence, and caused a ripple of awareness to spread through the corridor like electricity through water. Clint had been released 10 minutes earlier, his belongings hastily repacked and returned with the kind of grunting efficiency that suggested his detainers had suddenly remembered they were supposed to be helpful. No apology had been offered, no explanation given for why a man asking about his seat assignment had warranted a full security screening. The flag had been folded carelessly and stuffed back into his bag with the same indifference one might show to a restaurant napkin. Now, as Clint emerged from the security corridor into the main terminal, the atmosphere had changed completely. Where before he had moved through the airport like a ghost, invisible, unremarkable, easily dismissed, now heads turned. Phones appeared in hands with the speed of gunfighters drawing weapons. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as travelers recognized the distinctive silhouette that had graced movie screens for decades. A woman near the coffee shop whispered urgently into her phone, "You're not going to believe this, but I think TSA just detained Clint Eastwood." A businessman lowered his newspaper, his eyes widening as he made the connection between the casual traveler he had barely noticed an hour ago and the Hollywood legend now walking past him with unmistakable presence. But it was the airport staff who felt the shift most acutely. Josh at the Phoenix Western counter caught sight of Clint approaching and felt his stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables. The confident smirk that had carried him through the morning evaporated, replaced by the cold realization that his casual dismissal of an unimportant passenger had just become a very public mistake. Airport Supervisor Williams appeared in the terminal, his lanyard swinging as he hurried toward Clint with the desperate energy of a man trying to prevent a disaster that had already begun. Behind him trailed a small entourage of officials who had materialized from various administrative offices, each wearing the expression of someone who had just received a very uncomfortable phone call from corporate headquarters. "Mr. Eastwood," Williams began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of crisis management. "Sir, I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding this morning. We weren't aware." The word hit the terminal like a thunderclap. Not shouted, not screamed, not delivered with the theatrical fury that lesser men might have employed. Just spoken with the absolute authority of someone who had commanded respect on movie sets, in boardrooms, and in life for 7 decades. The single syllable cut through Williams' corporate speak like a knife through silk, reducing every excuse, every justification, every attempt at damage control to meaningless noise. The effect was immediate and profound. Williams' mouth closed mid-sentence. The small crowd of officials behind him seemed to shrink back as if they had been physically struck. Even the ambient noise of the terminal, the rolling of luggage wheels, the beeping of ground vehicles, the constant chatter of travelers, seemed to diminish in the face of that one perfectly delivered word. Clint stood perfectly still, his canvas bag at his feet, his presence filling the space around him like a force field. He didn't need to raise his voice or wave his arms or demand attention. He simply existed in that moment with such concentrated dignity that everyone within 50 feet understood they were witnessing something rare. A man who had never confused volume with power, who had learned that true authority whispers while weakness shouts. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of anticipation, heavy with the weight of consequences about to unfold. The silence that followed Clint's command stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of accumulated tension. Around the terminal, phones continued to record, capturing what would soon become one of the most shared moments in airport history. But in that frozen tableau, it wasn't the cameras that mattered. It was the reckoning that was about to unfold. Supervisor Williams opened his mouth to speak again, perhaps hoping to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his training manual. But Clint's eyes, those steel blue eyes that had stared down outlaws in countless westerns, fixed on him with such intensity that the words died in his throat. "I don't care if you knew my name," Clint said, his voice carrying the same measured cadence that had once made movie villains reconsider their life choices. "You don't need to know someone's name to give them basic respect." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through decades of institutional arrogance with the efficiency of a master craftsman. Williams shifted uncomfortably, his clipboard suddenly feeling heavy in his hands, as if it had transformed from a symbol of authority into evidence of his own incompetence. "This wasn't protocol," Clint continued, taking a single step forward that somehow managed to reduce the space between them without feeling threatening. "This was pride." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Around the terminal, passengers had stopped pretending they weren't watching. Some held their phones openly now, no longer caring about discretion. Others simply stood transfixed, witnessing what felt like a master class in how to dismantle institutional bullying without raising one's voice. From somewhere behind the growing crowd, Josh appeared, his face pale and his confident smirk replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had just realized the magnitude of his mistake. He tried to blend into the group of officials, but Clint's attention found him with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. "You called security," Clint said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, "because I asked why my seat was changed." Josh's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. The simple truth of the statement was undeniable. And in that moment, every witness understood exactly how a reasonable question had been transformed into a security incident through nothing more than wounded ego and petty authority. Gate manager Patricia Hoffman arrived on the scene, her polyester blazer wrinkled from her hasty journey across the terminal. She carried herself with the desperate energy of someone who had spent the last 20 minutes fielding increasingly frantic phone calls from corporate headquarters. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the terminal's air conditioning. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice pitched slightly too high, betraying her nervousness. "We'd be happy to offer you a rebooking, first class, of course. Anything we can do to make this right." Clint turned to face her, and for a moment, Patricia felt like she was standing in the crosshairs of history itself. The offer of an upgrade, the standard corporate response to customer complaints, suddenly seemed not just inadequate, but almost insulting in the face of what had transpired. "This isn't about a seat," Clint replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You can't fix this with an upgrade. You fix it with accountability." The word accountability seemed to echo through the terminal like a church bell, calling everyone present to examine their own conscience. Patricia's practiced smile faltered as she realized that all the training in customer service recovery had prepared her for angry passengers demanding compensation, not for moral reckonings delivered with quiet dignity. Behind her, Williams fumbled with his radio, perhaps hoping for guidance from some higher authority, but finding only static and the growing realization that this moment would define not just his career, but his character. By 8:47 a.m., the 25-second video clip had already traveled further than Clint's cancelled flight to Boise ever could. A college student named Sarah Martinez had captured the stop moment on her phone, and within minutes of posting it to social media, the footage had begun its viral journey across the digital landscape. The caption was simple: "Airport staff detain elderly passenger for asking a question. Then they realize who he is." But something extraordinary began happening in the comments section, something that transcended the usual internet noise of outrage and opinion. Real people started sharing real stories, each one a testament to the universal nature of what Clint had experienced. "This happened to me last month," wrote Carla Nguyen, a nurse from Portland. "I asked why my gait had changed, and they treated me like I was planning something terrible. Made me miss my connecting flight to see my father before his surgery." The story resonated like a tuning fork struck in a crowded room. More voices joined the conversation, each adding their own verse to a chorus that had been singing in silence for years. Diego Ramirez, a high school teacher from Phoenix, shared his experience. "They pulled me aside because I stuttered when I was nervous about flying. Said my erratic behavior was suspicious. I wasn't being difficult. I was just scared." An elderly woman named Eleanor Patterson from Tucson typed with shaking fingers. "My husband served in Korea. They called his military ID outdated and searched him like a criminal. He didn't say anything, just stood there while they went through his medication. He passed away 3 months later, still talking about how ashamed he felt that day." The stories poured in like water through a broken dam. A businessman who had been questioned for taking notes during a delayed flight. A mother whose questions about traveling with baby formula had somehow escalated into a security screening. A veteran whose service dog had been treated with suspicion rather than respect. Each story followed the same pattern. A reasonable question or normal behavior transformed into suspicious activity by officials who seemed to have forgotten that authority was meant to serve, not to intimidate. Back at Hollywood Burbank Airport, Patricia Hoffman sat in her cramped office, watching her computer screen with growing horror as the notifications multiplied exponentially. The phone hadn't stopped ringing. Local news stations, national media outlets, corporate headquarters, and dozens of passengers sharing their own encounters with overzealous airport security. Josh Martinez had already been sent home for the day, his supervisor suggesting he might want to consider his future with the company. The young man sat in his apartment, scrolling through the comments with the sick fascination of someone watching their own reputation dissolve in real time. Every shared story felt like another nail in the coffin of his career in customer service. But the most powerful responses weren't coming from media personalities or celebrity supporters. They were coming from ordinary people who had finally found their voice through Clint's example of quiet dignity under pressure. "I never said anything when they treated me badly," wrote Maria Santos, a janitor from Los Angeles. "I thought if I complained, they'd just make it worse." Seeing this man stand up for himself, not by yelling or making a scene, but just by refusing to be invisible, it makes me think I should have spoken up too. A retired firefighter named Robert Chen added, "Respect isn't earned by your job title or your bank account. It's owed to every human being just for being human." This video reminded me of something I'd forgotten. The conversation had evolved beyond Clint Eastwood, beyond airport security, beyond any single incident. It had become a mirror reflecting back years of accumulated indignities that people had learned to accept as normal. 3 months later, Clint Eastwood sat on the wraparound porch of his Carmel ranch, watching the morning fog roll in from the Pacific. The wooden chair creaked gently as he rocked, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the years. In his lap lay a stack of letters, not fan mail, but something far more meaningful. These were stories from ordinary people whose lives had been quietly touched by a moment they had witnessed through a phone screen. The interview requests had been relentless. Every major network, every talk show, every news magazine had wanted him to relive that morning at Hollywood Burbank Airport. But Clint had declined them all with the same polite firmness he had used to decline overly dramatic movie roles. This wasn't about creating a spectacle. It was about preserving the dignity of a moment that had meant something real to real people. Instead, he had written a letter, not to Hollywood reporters or network executives, but to the small-town newspapers that still understood the power of simple truths simply told. The words had come slowly, carefully, like the precise movements of a craftsman shaping something meant to last. Respect isn't something you give after recognition. It's what you owe before you know who someone is. Too many of us have forgotten that every person carries stories we'll never hear, battles we'll never see, and dignity that doesn't depend on our approval. The letter had been published in the Carmel Pine Cone first, then picked up by papers in Boise, Phoenix, and dozens of other communities across the country. It wasn't the kind of statement that made headlines, but it was the kind that people clipped out and taped to refrigerators, shared at dinner tables, and remembered long after the news cycle had moved on. The changes that followed were quiet but profound. Phoenix Western Airlines had implemented new customer service training focused on treating every passenger with the same respect they would show their own family members. Josh Martinez had taken a job at a local bookstore, where he discovered that helping people find what they were looking for felt infinitely better than creating obstacles in their path. TSA offices across the country had begun displaying small placards with a simple message: "Every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity and respect." It wasn't revolutionary policy, just a reminder of something that should have been obvious all along. In Boise, Idaho, Ray Kowalski's daughter Rebecca had framed a photograph from her father's memorial service, the one Clint had missed. But she had also framed something else, a printout of the letter he had written, with one line highlighted in yellow. "Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with raised voices, but with quiet refusal to accept what's wrong." Dad would have loved this, she told her children as they gathered around the kitchen table one evening. He always said the best way to honor a principle is to live it, not just talk about it. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways that defied measurement. Airport employees began asking themselves different questions. How would I want my grandfather treated? Instead of, what can I get away with? Passengers started speaking up more often, but also more thoughtfully, understanding that dignity was a two-way street. Clint folded the last letter and placed it with the others. Tomorrow, he would write responses to as many as he could, not because he owed anyone an explanation, but because these people had taken the time to share their stories, and stories deserved to be acknowledged. The revolution that had begun with a single word, stop, had become something larger, a quiet reminder that in a world increasingly divided by noise, the most powerful force remained the simple act of treating each other like human beings worth listening to. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.